you're either racist or anti-racist. Which one do you want to be? Well, not a racist. That's right. You want to be anti-racist. Yes. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean just not racist. It means, according to Ibram X. Kendi, you can't be anti-racist without being anti-capitalist. You can't be anti-capitalist without being anti-racist. You can't be anti-racist without being anti-homophobic and transphobic and every category, race, sex, gender, and so forth. It's about throwing out the entire system. We are experiencing revolution here. And the churches have bought this because we assume a doctrine of original sin, that we are all sinners. And so we are very easily convinced when someone says you're a sinner. Well, yeah. You're guilty. Well, yeah. You're unjust. Well, yeah. You're an oppressor. Well, yeah. You're white, male, Christian, heteronormative oppressor, and all these other people are down and out and they're dying and committing suicide, and you're the cause of it. Well, yeah. Yeah. No longer is it skinny jeans and fog machines in the churches. It's now social justice, and everybody wants to be part of that game.
All right, welcome everyone. This is the inaugural Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. My name is Anthony Costello, and we are honored today for our inaugural podcast to have Dr. Corey Miller with us to kickstart this whole project. Corey, it's great to have you on. How are you doing today?
Great to be here, Tony. I'm thrilled. It's a crazy time out there in our culture, and as is often said, ideas have consequences, and that's what we're seeing.
Well, that's right, and we're going to get to a lot of those ideas today. Corey, let me go ahead and give a short bio of you. You have a very unique background. I suppose everybody has a unique background, but yours seems especially suited to the kind of work that you do. Corey Miller has a PhD in philosophy of religion, and is the current president and CEO of Ratio Christi Campus Ministries. Corey grew up in Utah, sixth-generation Mormon, but came to Christ in 1988. He served on pastoral staff at 4 churches and has taught nearly 100 college courses in philosophy, theology, rhetoric, and comparative religions at places like Purdue, Indiana University, Multnomah, and Ecola Bible College. He's published in various journals like the International Philosophical Quarterly, Philosophia Christi, and the Christian Research Journal. Dr. Miller holds master's degrees in philosophy, biblical studies, and philosophy of religion and ethics, and his PhD is from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Corey lives with his wife, Melinda, and their 3 children in Indiana. Corey, is there anything that I missed that you'd like to add to that already impressive biography?
No, that's just fine. Thanks, Tony.
All right. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about Ratio Christi first before we get to our content. We'd like to hear more about the ministry that you guys do.
Sure, thank you. Ratio Christi is Latin for the reason of Christ. It is a Christocentric, not merely a theocentric, think tank organization that is about apologetics evangelism or evangelistic apologetics on predominantly secular university campuses. Our mission is to equip students and faculty with historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus, and we're all about thoughtful Christianity. We transform lives on campus today and change the culture tomorrow.
And what's the extent of Ratio Christi now? I mean, how many different chapters do we have, and where are they?
We're on about 125 campuses from Rutgers to UCLA, having high school, college prep groups, having professor groups, mostly student university groups, and we're also in a variety of countries like Pakistan, Study Center in London, South Africa, just got charitable status up in Canada, have an MA apologetics program in Southeast Asia that we run and so forth. So it's been around for about a decade, but God is really moving through it.
Wow, that's some incredible growth in that short a time. I remember when I heard about the chapter in Pakistan opening and saw some of the earlier. That was I had a stint in Afghanistan myself with the 82nd Airborne Division. And
Hmm.
just to know there's something like Ratio Christi in an area like Pakistan really is inspiring, right? And it really is a good testimony to what God can do if we just put our sort of nose to the grindstone and try and follow his will carefully.
Yes, and you and I both being prior military, we can appreciate this. We look at Ratio Christi as a special ops ministry.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, that's a good analogy for sure. Sort of infiltrating behind enemy lines,
Yeah,
but with the gospel.
yeah, good news.
Well, great, Corey. So the way we thought we would structure today's interview, as you with our guest contributor here, is there were three phases that we wanted to talk about of how you have seen and understood, and you've been embedded in this world for a long time now in virtue of all your PhD work and being a professor and a teacher at various institutions, of how things have developed in the academy over the last several decades, and why we're sort of seeing the cultural phenomena that we're seeing now, that can certainly appear very scary to many of us in the church. So phase one, which we kind of called sort of losing the universities in the West, or what you've called the phenomena of missional drift. Okay, and there's an excellent article you wrote for Christian Research Institute called "How We Lost the Universities and How to Reclaim the Voice of Christ." We'll post a link to that in the YouTube channel. But let's start with this idea of missional drift. As I read through the article, I was sort of reminded of Francis Schaeffer's model of how sort of ideas sort of grab hold in the academy and then filter down to the popular culture. Is that something like what you're getting at with missional drift, where sort of universities start to lose their anchoring to their traditional Christian foundations, and then that filters out into the culture?
Sure, and mission drift is a broader concept that's even talked about in the business world. It's talked about in, parachurches across the board, from Christian Children's Fund to Compassion International, Chick-fil-A, whatever. Some are more faithful, some drift. And with respect to the universities, yes, this is par for the course. It's almost not a matter of, if, but when the university is going to drift if you don't guard that mission like a hawk. And that's what happened with the American university. The way it started out is not even remotely close to where it is today.
So you said not if, but when. Is this something that is just an inevitability then? Or how do we see this? Does it have to happen, or?
It's almost like a law of physics, entropy, going from order to disorder, or usable energy to unusable energy. And, things began well in the United States long before it was the United States in 1776. About 150 years before that is when the first universities began. And the universities had an ethos, they had an ethos, but they had a telos, Greek word for end, purpose, or goal. They had a mission, and their mission, I like how Jonathan Haidt, who's an atheist, writing on part of this topic as well, he puts up two kinds of universities today. He puts up truth universities and social justice universities, but he begins with that, and he says that, look, there's been two philosophers from the modern era who said well what we're getting at here. John Stuart Mill said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons of the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." So from Mill's perspective, and from others, the telos of the universities would be truth, the pursuit of truth. Later, a philosopher came along, Karl Marx. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later.
Right.
Universities began with the very first one was Harvard in 1636, founded by the Puritans. And the motto was Veritas, truth. Within a couple decades, they modified it, and that modification stuck for almost 300 years until 1936, Truth for Christ and the Church. And so they were about debate. They were about the pursuit of truth. And I think our university systems flourished, and you can look at, almost every one of them, at least 104 out of the first 119 were actually Christ-centered in this country. Up until 1840, the college president of every university was also a member of the clergy. And up till 1890, church and chapel attendance were still required at every university in the country.
Right. Wow. It's a very different world than we live in than that right now.
Yeah.
So I know we're going to get into sort of the history of I don't know if we want to call it the evolution or the devolution of higher education in the U.S. But before we do that, I want to just touch on one point that I think came up in your article. You mentioned Vishal Mangalwadi, who I've met personally and who also has spoken a lot on Christian education.
Yes.
So now, because we're talking about here two different kinds of universities, one of which has as its main telos the discovery and articulation of truth.
Mm-hmm.
That also would be something that, the ancient philosophers would have been interested in. So it's not reserved solely for Christian higher education, but we could go all the way back to, of course, the Socratic philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, of course, sort of as the final voice of the three great Greek philosophers who we often draw from, and that the church has always drawn from in its history. But how does sort of the Greek tradition relate to Christian education as it developed in our own country? But how does it differ as well, in your view?
The Greek tradition, so I've got a recent book out on this, on In Search of the Good Life Through the Eyes of Aristotle, Maimonides, and Aquinas. Interestingly, the Catholic, the Jew, and the pagan philosopher all saw that the ultimate end in life, the ultimate telos, was the knowledge of God. Knowledge was central. Knowledge was thought to be discoverable. It was objective. There was a thing called truth, and you can know it. And Christianity came along, as did Islam, as did Judaism, and adopted and adapted this teleological worldview to their own system of thinking. And in the Christian position, we begin with Jesus 2,000 years ago. He said, "Here then is eternal life, to know God." So central to the Christian experience, to the Christian life, is knowledge. It's not a faith tradition, so to speak. It's a knowledge tradition. And that accounts for why, running through the Middle Ages, where the first universities from Paris to Bologna to you name it, the very first universities that began were all started by Christians, with the idea that faith seeking understanding, fides quorens intellectum, and that's what then came over into America. It was those Christian thinkers. We have to credit those people for founding what we look at today as the universities.
Right. So there was certainly a synthesis, and people will often talk about the medieval synthesis of Christian, the content of Christianity, which was given to us in special revelation, but then where the church sort of, to use the phrase, plundered from Egypt, plundered from the best of those thinkers who had general revelation and common grace, basically, right? Whether it be sort of Augustine taking from the Neoplatonists, or obviously Aquinas in the Middle Ages synthesizing Aristotelian thinking and categories with special revelation from the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Where Jerusalem and Athens, what hath Jerusalem to do with Athens? Faith and reason, or religion and reason. In reality, the Christian viewpoint has always been that religion is reasonable. The Christian religion is, and it's about knowledge. It's not just about blind faith. And again, this is why you can explain not just as a matter of historical accident, but it's part of the DNA of the Christian worldview that helps to explain how the universities arose in Christian medieval Europe and then beyond in America. And as Magawati says, goes on into, Korea and India and so forth. When the Christians landed in America, the mottos of all the schools was quite amazing. Veritas for Christ in the Church at Harvard, and then Yale. After Harvard began to drift, Yale decided that they would start afresh and one up them and call it lux et veritas, or light and truth, in reference to Psalm 27. And then Columbia, or Princeton comes along and does the same thing, and as the two books, the Old and New Testament, on their model, under God she flourishes. And then Columbia University, the first one in New York, but probably the fourth in the country. I saw this one myself when I was there. I've been at all of these campuses. Harvard, I have not. I'll be there in 2 weeks, though. But when I was at Columbia, I'd never had the history of that one. But I just walked around the campus and I found etched in the walls, "In thy light we shall see light," quoting Psalm 36. Mm-hmm. All of these universities were Christ-centered. They began as missionary and minister training centers. Faith was not blind. The Christian faith, was a knowledge tradition.
Boy, it's almost hard to think of Columbia in that way these days, right?
Right.
Think of all the people that have come out of Columbia and the ideas that have come out of there recently. I think Prager went there and did a master's degree in Eastern Studies or Russian Studies. He talks about it quite a bit. So, and the reason though, going back to the Greeks and that synthesis, and I think we'll come to this when we look at phase 2, which is where we're going to delve into cultural Marxism. It seems that there's a rejection of two great traditions currently. One is, of course, the Judeo-Christian worldview, which is grounded in the special revelation of the Bible. But the other is also of sort of the Western canon of philosophy and literature, going back to the Greeks, that this is also sort of rejected in our times, or maybe has been for a while. Do you think that's a correct sort of assessment of the situation?
Yes. At the rise of modernity, if you think about this from a philosophical viewpoint, philosophy has its own subject matter, 3 major branches: reality, knowledge, and ethics, or metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, where we begin from the foundation asking what is real, and then move on to how do I know what is real, and then finally, how should I then live based on what I know about reality? We began with first philosophy, with metaphysics. Once you move into the modernist period, or the Enlightenment period, you begin with Descartes, who was a Christian believer, but he got us off on the wrong foot. I think therefore I am, he was that guy, the father of modern geometry, but he began with epistemology, and he began with skepticism, so that in almost all introduction to philosophy textbooks today, you have an introductory chapter on skepticism. And so Descartes began with skepticism. That launched the Enlightenment, and he wanted to get us to the point of absolute certainty, divorced from, say, revelation. He wanted to start not based on authority or with ultimate reality, but to start with reason, human reason in particular. And there became a battle in the modernist period between the empiricists and the rationalists. And at the end of the Enlightenment, it seems that, Immanuel Kant tried to tie the bow and tried to merge the two and failed. And he gave us, you can't know ultimate reality. And so during the Enlightenment period, that is where at least the empirical wing of the fight, I think, had more traction, and we entered into not just, embracing empirical ways of knowing, but it became empiricism and later scientism. The absolutization of science and the scientific revolution happened. And again, almost all of the major founders of the subdisciplines of sciences by name were Christians too.
Mhm.
But it began to drift even from those moorings. And you leave the modernist period to get to the postmodern period. And those people now were beginning not only to, agree with the modernists against maybe the rejection of metaphysics, or at least not starting there, but they even said touche to epistemology or theory of knowledge. Whereas the modernists said we can know truth, but it was really only empirical truth,
Right.
scientific truth.
Natural facts, right?
Yes, the postmodernist comes along and says, we agree with you against metaphysical truth, but touche, same thing with science truth. All knowledge is but a social construction of reality. And so you get
Right.
relativism. And
Right.
it almost follows those three branches at the same time that those periods are changing as well. What is real? How do I know what is real? How should I then live based on what I know about reality? And the university has been divided up into two camps, into the hard sciences and into the humanities and social sciences, who wants to try to be a hard science. And of course, after the Enlightenment, everybody wants to claim that their view is a science. Well, now, in the recent times, that whole narrative is being thrown up in the air as something that's Western, colonialist, logical
Right.
fashion.
Science itself is
Yeah,
put under the microscope, so to say.
yeah.
Yeah. Let me just, for the sake of our audience, and then I'm trying to moderate this, let me back up a little bit, because we just covered a lot of ground there,
Mhm.
and I want to make sure this is clear for folks. So we've mentioned a few names, folks like Descartes and Kant, and we've mentioned a few areas of philosophy like metaphysics and epistemology. Um, Give us some quick timelines. When we talk about Descartes moving into the Enlightenment,
Mhm.
literally what time in history are we talking about? And then
The-
also give us just some quick and dirty definitions of metaphysics, what is entailed in metaphysical speculation, and then also the shift to epistemology.
So the Enlightenment period begins with Descartes, who we say got Descartes before the horse,
Mhm.
and it
Like
ends with Kant,
17th century,
1650
right?
to about 1800 was the Enlightenment time, culminating with Kant, with whom you can't know ultimate reality.
Right.
And Kant was the father then of modern agnosticism, and through that, all sorts of trajectories happened.
And of course, you have Hume sandwiched in between the two, right? Would be also
Yeah, Kant was a rationalist. He read Hume, and he said that the shackles of his eyes had fallen off, and he tried to merge them. So with the rationalist, you had people like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, the fathers of modern geometry, calculus, and so forth. And then with the empiricists, you had people like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume.
for mainly
Uh,
the British sort of strain of rationalism then.
Empiricism.
Yeah.
Yeah. hmm And so you had the two camps that kind of went back to their Greek predecessors. The empiricists followed a
Mhm.
little bit along the lines of Aristotle, and the rationalists followed along the lines of Plato.
Right. So when we talk about metaphysics, because we have obviously, um, if how do we do? I mean, one of the things that is developed out of this is, modern theology.
hmm
You ask the question, how do you do theology without metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit, just give us a quick definition of what metaphysics is and what happens after Kant with the pursuit of metaphysical thinking and metaphysical reasoning or speculation.
Yeah, right. Aristotle had a book called The Physics, and then we move on to what is called metaphysics, and that is beyond the physics. So it's the non-sense perceptible realm, but it is inclusive even of the sense perceptible realm. It denotes all of reality. So the question, what is real? Are atoms real? Is God real? Are strings real? Are souls real? Is free will real? Epistemology is the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. And the Latin derivation of that then is scientia, which we have our term science, but they never meant, even in the medievals, chemistry and
Mhm.
physics only. They meant all fields of knowledge. And so you had reality, what is real, and then epistemology, the study of knowledge or theories of knowledge, evidence, rationality, and so forth. And then finally, you have ethics, the good, right, and so forth, the good life. How do I live? You first have to ask, well, what do I know? Before that, you have to ask, what is real? What is real? How do I know what is real? How should I then live based on what I know about reality? That, in a nutshell, is the love of wisdom philosophy. And behind every PhD is a doctorate of philosophy. Everybody at that level is a philosopher, even if they've never had a class in it. They're all practicing it. And that's what's happening in the universities.
Right. So after Kant, there's this sense, at least, that we can't sort of do metaphysics. Would that be fair to say? Or if metaphysics sort of gets, I don't know, subjugated to epistemology?
Yeah, I mean, epistemology was all the rage. It was the focal point for the Enlightenment. The goal of the Enlightenment was certainty, and through human means, right? Human reason. We begin with man. Um, Kant then became the guy who even questioned epistemology, and that's where the first time we hear critical comes in, like today we might use the term critical theory, the critique of pure reason, then the critique of practical reason, and so forth. But Kant certainly questioned, even when he gave ethics, he wanted ethics within the bounds of reason, right? Not religion. And Kant impacted, after he read Hume, of course, he had an impact on skepticism in that realm, because Hume was the father of skepticism. Kant became the father of agnosticism. And everybody from Kant, you felt like either natural theology, theology derived from, general revelation, looking around at what's out there in the world, from, the cosmos to the maker of the cosmos, from the moral law to the moral law maker, and so forth. Natural theology was said to be dead after Kant and Hume killed it. But it's not just miracles that someone like Hume or even Kant went after. It impacts science as well. So if you buy into Hume's arguments, for example, a lot of skeptics love to cite Hume, and then they claim to root their worldviews into science. No, that's going to go as well, because of the problem of induction and other things.
So reason sort of becomes an acid that sort of eats away at itself, almost, in that sense, right? I mean,
yeah. Once if you look at the triangle and have the foundation, metaphysics or reality, and then epistemology, theory of knowledge up on top of that, and then on top of that, ethics. Once you take out the foundation of an edifice, what it is above it is going to fall down, and fall down hard. And there were already cracks at the beginning of the Enlightenment period focused on epistemology, and there was a big battle between the empiricists and the rationalists on this. It was only a matter of time, Tony, before we ended up in skepticism and then agnosticism because of that. And then once you get to ethics, how should I then live? Well, you get Nietzsche, a postmodern philosopher, however you want, if you have the biggest tanks or can flex the biggest muscle.
Right. So, okay, well, this is certainly the sort of brief survey of intellectual history that we wanted to hear about, and try, if you can, for us, bring this all up to the modern university in America. How then is this post-Enlightenment sort of problem of knowledge, and then, metaphysics, then knowledge, then ethics, and the whole edifice, but then it seems like within sort of let's say, an agnostic or maybe even an atheistic materialistic worldview, we seem to have these two branches of that. One is like sort of what I might call the classical atheist, or, who still thinks that, and you've kind of mentioned this, that science can help us to discover truth, even though that the truth only consists of something like natural facts. But we still have some tool grounded in reason to do like actual science and discover facts. And, maybe we'd put somebody like I don't know if we put like a Bertrand Russell of yesteryear or like a Dawkins of today in that group. But then we have what you said happened in the humanities departments, you know, where we take this turn where now science itself is even put under the microscope. And it's not so much about discovering truths about external facts, but the scientist, him or herself, is under scrutiny,
Hmm.
and their interpretation of things becomes primary. And this is, I think, going to lead us into our discussion on sort of Marxism and the cultural Marxism. So
Right.
am I right in sort of suggesting that there's two kind of branches that come out of the Enlightenment here, a sort of scientific, materialistic one, and then more of an existential sort of postmodern one?
Right. And that postmodern is a deviation from modernity, or you might call it hyper modernity,
Mm-hmm.
where it just extends the deterioration of uh, good thinking that has been around for a couple thousand years. So we had the correspondence theory of truth. Truth is that which corresponds to reality, or that which squares with the way things are. To today, where truth is that which my peers will let me get away with,
Mm-hmm.
Richard Rorty and so forth.
Gordy's line, yeah.
Yeah, but if you look at this again historically of what was happening at the time, to put things into perspective, the Enlightenment period from Descartes to Kant was 1650 to 1800. The universities, Harvard, 1636 Puritans,
Mm-hmm.
all the way up through Columbia and so forth, about 1750, and those universities stayed faithful all the way up until about 1850. So almost 200 years. And again, every president was a member of the clergy up to 1840. But in around 1870, many of all of our universities and colleges, none of them had a graduate school. Johns Hopkins, I think, was the first. So people would go off to the continent, to Germany, to England, and they would go to grad school. They would come back and they would get into key posts in the academic arena in America. And they would bring back with them, every PhD has a doctorate of philosophy behind it, certain philosophical ways of thinking of the Enlightenment, the fact-value dichotomy, the dichotomy between faith and reason. At the time, 1859 was Darwin's Origin of the Species, so biological evolutionary theory and biblical higher criticism was beginning then, that came right out of the Enlightenment. The question about miracles. And so Thomas Jefferson exacto blades out all the miracle components in his New Testament. And so you get the rise of deism. So that stuff is coming back over from the continent, from Europe, over into America. And those people with higher graduate degrees ended up being more salient in their CV, you might say, in their resume, and took key posts. And you saw the battles ensuing at Princeton and Yale and Columbia and Harvard and many of these original universities. You watched it happening between 1880 and 1930.
So
There
this
were
is
some,
really the point of missional drift that starts
yes,
happening at this time, late 19th century, in lieu of the higher biblical criticism being done in Germany, the advent of Darwinian evolution as a theory of origins, and so on. It kind of creates a perfect storm at these Christian institutions, especially the ones on the East Coast.
yes, and there were some practical needs trying to be serviced as well when the population was growing and many people were moving into an area. If you have Princeton, which is a sectarian school geared toward Presbyterians, right? Each of them were sectarian to begin with, rather than secular. And by secular, we don't mean humanist or atheist. We simply mean not sectarian, not a sect. They were trying to service their own people, but the populations were growing. They needed to be servicing more people. Today, we call it the online competition. Everybody's teaching online, so all the other universities are doing it. But people needed jobs. And so the universities started adding, technology and other things, and began to shift the focus of the university, which began from the medieval times that theology is the queen of the scientia, the knowledge disciplines, and
Mhm.
philosophy, it's handmaiden, right? So you can look at it like a hub with a bunch of spokes, where theology is the hub and the spokes are physics and mathematics and language and history and so forth. So every PhD is a doctorate in philosophy. In the Enlightenment, theology got ripped out and it became atheology. Naturalism became the core hub. That wasn't so yet in America, but it began to take on that light. And that's why all the departments started changing their names too, to not just politics, which was always part of ethics, always,
Right.
from Parmenides on up until Kant. Now it's called political science or economic science or psychological sciences, which psychology is the study of the soul. But they began to change because they were trying to satisfy the lights of the Enlightenment, which science came to win the day, or skepticism did, and you ended up in existentialism. But the universities at this time then, they lasted faithfully for about 200 years and really almost up to 250. But that transformation was happening, that mission drift from, 1880 to 1930. By the time 1930 rolls around, the dust was settling. The gig was up, the game was over. It went from what George Marston calls in his book, from Protestant establishment, since virtually every college and university were Protestant at this time, from Protestant establishment to established non-belief. It wasn't atheism, it wasn't Richard Dawkins, it wasn't secular humanism that caused mission drift. It was false philosophy embedded in liberal Protestant theology. And those people who got in key positions began to create drift in those once faithful Christian think tanks. And by 1930, it was over, and you began a series. And during that time, you also saw the shift inside the organizations, pushing the divinity schools off into their own little corners, into theological seminaries, into divinity schools. It was no longer the heart of the university. It was now just a small part of it. And eventually those got taken over as well. And you started the new movements of, from Princeton Theological Seminary to, Westminster, and you started Biola University, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, Moody Bible, and all of those, right, in the 20th century. So you had almost a retreat, or maybe a tactical retreat, starting over after phase one.
Right. So there's kind of three phenomena here. One is the secularization of the traditional Protestant universities. Then everything sort of splintering into what we might call the modern research sort of university. Everything gets splintered off into separate departments that are then called, this science, that science, because there's no really unifying, as you said early on in the interview, no unifying telos anymore, right? Everybody's just going to do their own little, very specified work, but there's no capstone sort of holding it together anymore. Would that be a fair to?
The telos could still be truth, but it was scientific truth.
Truth, and not theological.
That was only known through the five senses, because the cousin or the foundation of scientism is naturalism. So that was the new queen of the Scientia, was naturalism.
Right. And then in light of that, you get sort of these, these, I don't know what we'd call it, newer Christian institutions who are sort of saying we have to sort of start over. We've sort of lost the big three and the other sort of Ivy schools. So let's redo. Let's start over and try and reinvigorate a more classical understanding of with theology at the top, and that's where you get the seminaries or schools like the Bible Institute, Biola, Moody, and so on and so forth. Is that kind of what?
Yeah, you might look at that in the same way of the Protestant Reformation, always trying to reform within, and then finally, when they felt like they couldn't, they had to break and became the protesters or Protestants. Well, this is the Reformation of the American Academy, you might say. You couldn't reform within anymore. They had all the positions of power and influence, and the more traditional voices were pushed out. And so, yes, they had to begin again and start the whole process over.
Well, and I think maybe we'll come back to towards the end of our interview where we think some of these institutions that cropped up in the early part of the 20th century, where we think they're going now, because now they've been around for 100 or so years, and
Yep.
and we've both been sort of integral in some of the things going on at you already mentioned at Biola. So but let's put that on the shelf for now. We'll try and come back to that towards the end, because I think that will be relevant. But we want to start moving into phase 2 here, which is our discussion of Karl Marx, and sort of a little bit of what classical Marxism is, and then the neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. These are big, popular terms right now. They're being thrown around all over the internet and all over the media. And maybe you can help us guide us through a little bit then. So what happens then in the post-Enlightenment, sort of starting with Marx and his views? How are those maybe different than some of the other Enlightenment views? And then how did sort of Marxism, you think, come over to the West and sort of infiltrate, if that's the right way to put it, infiltrate many of these new departments that we kind of just mentioned at the big universities?
Yeah, and so to put Marx in perspective, his period was 1818 to 1883. So right after the end of the Enlightenment, he would be marked as a postmodern thinker. Marx never had any arguments for God's non-existence. He just assumed that natural theology had been destroyed and biblical revelation was destroyed, and that religion was simply the opium of the masses, or the drug for those who, in a tough world, couldn't purchase opium to get through life. They had to purchase religion instead. And so religion is the opium of the masses, the poor sigh of the oppressed. Religion was the sigh of the oppressed creature, and they became the oppressors with religion, as it turned out as well. But Marxism is often thought of in terms of an economic theory of communism. But really, critical economic criticism was his third more important issue.
Right.
His second more important was political criticism, and prior to that was religious criticism. So even going back to Marx, then it wasn't about capitalism versus communism. He believed that in order for his prediction to come to fruition, the utopia of equality, so that men and women were no longer oppressed creatures, they would have to get rid of religion. They would have to shed its snake skin, and they would do so willingly if you gave everybody, say, an iPhone 10 or whatever the latest gadget.
The stuff they needed, in other words.
Yeah, $30,000 or $50,000 a year salary.
Mm-hmm.
If you redistributed the wealth across the board, people are only religious because of socioeconomic oppression, right?
Yeah, or lack, right?
Right. Freud's idea, his criticism of religion was that it was internal, that there was some, we're not playing with a full deck there.
Mm-hmm.
It's psychosis, but it was internal. Maybe it was hard.
Freud, I think Freud saw it as necessary, though, right? I mean, didn't he? Maybe I'd be wrong on this. They thought if you got rid of religion, that we wouldn't be able to survive existentially. I may be wrong there, but whereas Marx thought, no, we could certainly jettison religion, or needed to get rid of it at some point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think he had some justifications of it. Interesting book on Freud and Lewis that someone might consult without getting off too far off the track. Marx saw the problem was external.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't an argument against religious belief or against the facts or arguments of religion. It just assumed they were all bad to begin with. It was now giving reasons for why people would have religious belief. They would be shooting air balls, as it were. It's delusional. But why are they delusional? Because they're oppressed. They are socioeconomically oppressed. But if you redistribute the wealth and get the capitalists who are exploiting the workers off their backs, and then everybody would flourish. It would be utopia. People wouldn't want to compete anymore because humans aren't basically evil. They're maybe basically good, or at least neutral, but they'll all just get along.
Right.
That's kind of where Marx was. And it was almost like scientifically predicted. He thought that if the conditions were right, then people would simply revolt, and capitalism had its seeds of its own destruction. And so after, World War I came around, and The Marxists thought, here it comes, here it comes. People are going to pull up their boots. The workers of the world are going to unite and throw off the shackles of the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, but they didn't. They pulled up their boots and they went to war with each other. And so after World War I, the Marxists got together and said, okay, we have to retool this. We have to rethink this. What's going on here? And they said there were some problems in Marxist thought. And one of them was looking at where to begin, the strategy, how to make this happen. It's not going to happen naturally. And we've got to think about the broader culture, not just the economic part of this, not just the class division. And so the cultural Marxists started with a term called critical theory. Comes from Kant, critical, critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and so forth, critiquing the prevailing narratives. And for these critical theorists, they were trying to critique theory, the narratives of Western civilization, and critique, tear them down. The family, the economics, the religion, and so forth. And so this Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, as it was called, in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany, arose. They're the popular ones, but there are many critical theories, but they're one of the popular ones. They rose up and they started thinking about how to go about this neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. At the same time, there was an Italian neo-Marxist named Alberto Gramsci in Italy, and he talked about how, we can't go after the coercive elements of society like government and military and law enforcement. We've got to go after education and religion, the non-coercive elements of society, and the coercive elements will follow suit.
So how do you have sort of a non-violent revolution, right?
Sure. I mean, in Marx's writings, he talked about the guillotine. He thought that religion would shed itself. It's like a snakeskin. He was open to nominal religion. But at the end of the day, you couldn't have serious religion because Marxism is a state-building worldview. That's why it can never get along with Islam and Sharia law. Look at Chechnya, for example.
As we saw in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. So the Marxists and the Muslims couldn't get along unless there's someone else who's ruling a city. Then they come together for a temporary alliance, like we're seeing in America.
Which we've seen play out as well.
Yes. But these neo-Marxists, then they thought, okay, what are we going to do? As they were planning, as they were scheming, Tony, it was a bad place to be if you were in Germany in 1933.
Right.
And
most of these thinkers were ethnically Jewish, as well. They had to get out of Dodge pretty quickly.
Yes, you had that. Most of them were Jewish, like Freud and like Marx.
And Marx, right? I think Marcuse and Horkheimer. I'm not sure about Horkheimer, but I think Adorno was ethnically Jewish as well. They had to get out of there.
They had to get out of there.
Free to
do a Jew, and you were a globalist socialist. The Nazis were also socialist. It's the National Socialist Party.
Right.
The Nazis were Antifa. The globalists were Antifa. They were anti-fascists. But they were still socialists, as we can see operating today, but we'll get there. And Stalin and Hitler never got along well. And, they had an alliance, but they did not like each other. And so what happened in 1933 when the Nazis rose to power is they had to get out of Dodge. They had to leave there. And where did they go? They went over the ocean and embedded themselves in Columbia University.
And Brandeis and
and began to spread through the Ivy Leagues, particularly from the social sciences, because this is the school of social science, sociology, others. It branched into women's studies and queer theory and all other kinds of studies, but in the humanities generally. But these people were now talking about not just dividing people among economic class, but along the lines of every possible way of race, class, sex, gender, nationality, and so forth, and trying to criticize the heck out of the prevailing narrative of Western civilization. And they began to write all their famous pieces that were, at their apex, most salient, right at the time of the 60s sexual and student
Mm-hmm.
revolution. And many of those people went on from there to go into academia and entered into the universities, furthering those ideologies, which still seem to be floating under the current. They weren't taken seriously, really, until you get to the 90s. And in the 90s, two things happened, Tony. You still had naturalism, which was ruling the universities, but
Mm-hmm.
naturalism created a lab for something to grow on its own in the humanities that they now have no control over. And that was this critical theory, Marxism, neo-Marxism. And what happened was that these people that the idea is that if you look at, again, philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, or what is real, how do I know real, what is real, how should I then live? It's essentially a view of reality where humans are at odds with one another in group identities. You're either part of the oppressor or the oppressed, the victim, the victimizer, the haves or the have-nots in race, class, sex, gender, and so forth. And you're at odds with one another in a constant interlocking fight. And then the goal, ultimately, the ultimate telos, is because of all those oppressions, those inequalities. Inequality entails somehow injustice. So if there's ever any inequality in race, class, sex, gender, it must be unjust. And so the goal is socially, group identity politics or identity power to liberate from socioeconomic, race, class, sex, gender, ability, national, everything, liberate the oppressed. It is social justice. And the epistemology, the knowledge, is best known by those who are in an oppressed class or an oppressed
Mm-hmm.
state. They have a secret or esoteric, Gnostic kind of knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that we need to listen to.
In virtue of their being oppressed, they have special knowledge.
Yes.
And the end goal of that is sort of a total flattening out then of all conditions, material conditions, where everybody's essentially not just equal, but the same almost.
Equality across the board. And
Across the
so
board.
we want equity. We have to force the equality now and take from, it's Robin Hood,
Mm-hmm.
rob from the rich, give to the poor, because as Obama said, you didn't earn that, right?
Right.
Marx's idea in economics is the same for all these other categories.
Categories, right.
That it's he viewed the economic growth as a pie, a zero-sum game, where if someone has 51% of the pie, or 5 slices versus say 3 slices,
Mm-hmm.
that is unequal.
That has to be
It's
rectified.
unjust.
Right.
Because in order to get 51%, you had to take it from the other person. It's not the idea of capitalism where it's the tide that lifts all boats, where the whole
Mm-hmm.
pie can grow. No, it's the idea that if anyone has inequality in a category, that is unjust. And so this neo-Marxism is about fighting back against the bourgeois, the ruling class, the oppressors in religion, Christianity,
Right.
heteronormativity, marriage,
Anything that has been sort of the dominant view at all.
yeah,
in history.
cisgender, what you were born with, as opposed to say transgender,
Mm-hmm.
sexual revolution, sexual rights, polyamory, again, race, class, sex, gender, everything across the board. It's very revolutionary. If you can't take over by violent revolution, you do it through infiltration. And that was what the neo-Marxists books were all about. And
Right.
that's what's happening. And so real quick, the second part of what was going on in the early 90s, while naturalism still ruled the universities, and they had this thing cooking up in the humanities over here that eventually morphed on its own, the ratio of left to right, liberal to conservative professors at the time was still about 2.3 to 1. And that's substantial once you start, adding up to 100 professors, and, where you end up getting, 50 to 25, or there's something like that. But still, 2.3 to 1, you've still got viewpoint diversity. You still
Right.
have heterodoxy. You still have room for debate. And you can debate things and still pursue truth. Only scientific truth, mind you, now. But you could still debate things. And that's where we were. But then all of a sudden there became this rise, this radical rise of the number of inequality, you might say. If there's anywhere where it's privileged, it's in the university, where the number of left to right professors was escalating in a way that we have never seen in the history of the country, such that now you have the ratio of professors that are retiring at 12 to 1. Professors that are under the age of 40 that give us the next 30 years, it's 23 to 1. In New England, it's 27 to 1. In some departments, like religious studies, it's 70 to 1.
That's incredible.
And with the rise of that, political homogenous orthodoxy, you might say,
Right.
was also simultaneously the rise of neo-Marxism, critical theory, social justice, identity politics inside the academy. And it was almost like Tom Cruise's movie, The War of the Worlds, where these alien life forces were embedded in the soil for who knows how long, and something triggered it, and they all came out, and all hell broke loose. That's what's been happening. And now even liberals, atheists, especially in the hard sciences, are going, what in the world just happened? And they're all being taken over now by critical theorists and their ideologies, even in the hard sciences. And that's what you're starting to see in culture. It's spreading into campus ministries and
That's the cancel culture then phenomena that we're seeing, right?
Absolutely. Because remember, Voltaire would say, I may disagree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. Stalin would say, ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons. Why should we let them have ideas? That's what we're seeing. That's what cancel culture is all about.
So before, and that's a great segue into our final section here on these sort of new kinds of alliances that you've been sort of spearheading with your work together with atheist philosopher Peter Boghossian. Before we launch into this final phase, though, what we're calling the Great Realignment, which finding common ground with former enemies, I do want to ask this question: where does authority come into play for the cultural Marxist? Is there an understanding of authority, or is authority literally just me and my experience?
That is an excellent question. This is a question that I hear a lot of people popping up, and I hear it popping up among a lot of people. What's the end goal? Once the Marxists take over, the workers of the world unite, take over the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, then what? Everyone's going to have equality? No, Kim Jong-il didn't live in a tent like all of his people. Fidel Castro didn't live in the same tent. The Soviet rulers didn't live in the same tent as all their masses. They become the new authority, bourgeoisie, right? The new ruling class. It never seems to work, and of course that's what we're always told. And when I took a graduate course on Marxism at Purdue by a distinguished professor of Marxism, everyone always says, "Oh, it's just really never been tried." It's just been abused, never really been tried. The idea is the ultimate telos, the ultimate goal is equality, and it is achievable. That's the utopia. That's what, from Marx to Lenin, or from Lenin the Marxist to John Lennon, the Beatles. Imagine, right. And you listen to the words of that song.
Yes,
it's right. He's an evangelist in that for utopian community.
And of course, as Christians, we'd say this good old-fashioned problem of original sin keeps messing up the works, doesn't it?
Yeah. Once you get into the position of authority, once the oppressed take authority,
Right.
they're not going to give it back.
And of course, just in virtue of rejecting the authority of Almighty God to begin with, right? Which is the fundamental
That's right.
metaphysical problem with the
That's
whole
right. And
thing.
that's a fundamental part where Marx went wrong, and all of his
Yeah,
followers throughout the ages, is that, which we can observe just by reading the newspapers or
right,
watching, online. Humans have an inclination towards selfishness, toward corruption, towards
right.
sin. And you can see that
Or just incompetency.
yeah, and it's
Sometimes
not
it's
just a
just,
Christian
yeah,
viewpoint. Ayn Rand, the atheist, held it, and
yeah,
Thomas Hobbes in the modern world
right,
held that.
right.
Mencius, one of Confucius' greatest disciples. So you get it in naturalism, you
Hmm.
get it in theism, and you get it in pantheism. You have people making just observations that people are not basically good. They have a tendency to serve self.
Right. And one book that I'll recommend for our audience, and I'll put a link to this on YouTube, is Alistair McIntyre, who, of course, was once a Marxist before
Yeah.
he became a devoted Roman Catholic after writing his book After Virtue in '81. But he wrote, while he was still sort of a Marxist theorist, at least, a really short book called Marxism and Christianity, which I
Hmm.
would highly recommend to all of our listeners to read, to show you how also Marx was not unaware of the content of Christianity and was providing, in one sense, the atheistic alternative to Christian, sort of a Christianity without Christ.
Yeah.
But that's a great little read. All right, well, Corey, bring us home with some of the work you've been doing to combat this grand problem of tearing down all of our traditional narratives with people that Christians might consider sort of on the other side of the problem anyways, sort of like people like Peter Boghossian, who is an avowed atheist. I think he's even written a book. Didn't he write a book, something like how to create atheists or something?
Yeah, a
So
manual for creating
there
atheists,
you go.
a
So
forward and an endorsement by Dawkins, Richard Dawkins.
how do we have alliances with people like Peter Boghossian, and what kind of work can be done there?
Yeah, he calls this the great realignment. I just talked with him last night,
Mhm.
incidentally. I asked him if, given 100 days of Antifa in Portland next to your university, are you going to vote for Trump? So we were joking back and forth about that. But yeah, he was the polar opposite. He's my metaphysical foe, you might say.
Mhm.
He has, the street epistemology that he tries to train people in how to treat Christians like patients, medical patients, psychiatric patients, being nice to them and asking Socratic questions and trying to help them to see that faith is a virus, whereas I say it's a virtue. And well, Peter and I, once he went through some really hard times because he went after social justice critical theory, well, along with two other atheist scholars, because they saw the nonsense of this stuff as scholarship. They hit a hornet's nest, and all of a sudden, the uber left, the new left, the neo-Marxists started coming after the left. He's a leftist. They're new leftists. And they were going for his job, and he was getting, threats and, being called a rapist and all kinds of just nasty stuff. And his office happens to be now in the building with the Portland State University Police Department. And when I walked him back there after he invited me to lecture in his atheism seminar class on arguments for God, I walked him back to his office and I said, "Why is your office in the police department?" And he says, "I don't know. They won't tell me. I think it's for my safety."
Oh, goodness. Wow.
But, he said he is done with the atheism theism debates for the time. He says he's dedicating everything toward going after social justice. He
Mhm.
says it is a matter of civilization here. And he's calling this, from his vantage point, the great realignment, where he has more in common with people like me than with the rest of the atheists. He said that him, Dawkins, Sam Harris, and others, he said, we have lost the war within atheism. Even on campuses, the non-theist societies, he said, they all hate me. They're all woke. They wouldn't help me at all. So Peter Boghossian and I formed kind of an alliance, and we did a university tour through several universities, and we're looking at doing it again in this next year on viewpoint diversity. I'm talking on the death of the university, the death of intellectual university, how social justice and identity politics are killing the university. It is stifling free thinking because it's very Stalinistic. And that's what happens, Tony. When you get a ratio of 2 to 1, okay. When you get 5 to 1, okay. 12 to 1, now you're talking, 90%. When you get 23 to 1 or even 70 to 1, there is a political orthodoxy there. You dare not violate the blasphemy laws. And that's what you're seeing. Even people on the left who were the, metaphysical foes of us 10 years ago are now being targeted by the uber left, the new left, this neo-Marxism. And so they're looking for alliances for the sake of civilization. And I said to Peter, I said, this is your problem, right? You guys.
I was wondering about that because it does seem like they opened up a void there.
I said,
that was then filled by the more existentially minded atheist, right?
Yeah. He calls phase one Obergefell, where the culture war 1.0 was finished. And he says, this is 2.0. I say, no, phase one was 1880 to 1930, right, when naturalism assumed control of the universities. Phase two began right in 1930s, but over in Germany, and then came over here. And over time, it was brewing, but something happened when the rise of the inequality of the number of left to right professors was happening. It was just the perfect timing. Everything was ready to go. And now all of a sudden it's spread, and the naturalists, especially in the hard sciences, cannot control this Frankenstein that has emerged. So I said, this was your fault, but I'll help you with it.
Well, you're right, because it's interesting. It's very ironic. I mean, the irony is sort of deep here, because I've always felt like the sort of the Bertrand Russell strain of atheism that, the very, logic-centered natural sciences can get us to, but there was always a negative critique of religious belief. But once the critique was done, there was never anything else on offer to sort of fill the void of religion or religious belief, or Christianity even more specifically. So, people just packed up their analytical tools and went home. Right. But then, Marx, and if you read again this book by McIntyre, Marx is, like you said, the economic theory is sort of down the line of what he was trying to do. He's trying to answer existential questions about the human condition that I think the sort of more scientific atheists just didn't really try and answer. So that the Marxist then comes in and says, well, if religion is false or Christianity is false, we'll offer you sort of a new alternative to that. Here it is, So, anyways, that's how I've tended to see what we're up against, and and there's something there theologically where we talk about social justice. It's a theological right? It is a theological concept, and I was reading some articles by Andrew Sullivan, who is by no means a staunch conservative, but who was one of the first ones to really start calling sort of the critical race theory and social justice phenomena a new religion of sorts, because it does seem to be trying to answer religious questions that people have, and existential concerns of the human condition, right? That sort of, again, the classical atheist modernist wasn't really interested in answering, or maybe even bothering to touch on it all.
Yeah, and so when you come back to this notion, classical liberalism, which is where Peter would call himself, he would say fits into that mold. these people believe in the correspondence theory of truth, that truth is that which corresponds with reality. Now, they only want scientific truth. They only want truth knowable by the five senses, right? They're modernists. They're Enlightenment thinkers in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
at least they believe that truth is real and knowable and objective,
Discoverable, right?
even if only through science.
Yeah.
And they at least have the demeanor where you can have a debate with them.
Mm-hmm.
With these postmodernists who, on the one hand, say that knowledge is but a social construction of reality, right, according to critical theory, and then they try to find room for objectivity in their universal knowledge claims from an oppressed angle, from what's called standpoint epistemology. They don't believe in having conversations. They say that debate is a form of hate. When Peter and I were getting ready to come to one of the universities in Utah, we had one new leftist group oppose us, write a letter to the president, and call us logical fascists because we were bringing Western colonialist oppressive tools to the game that have been used to oppress those who we are oppressing for centuries now. So
As if
this
Asian and African
diversity.
thinkers had never used logic before. Or
Right, and then you
it
saw what
doesn't
the
even
amount of,
seem ethnographically accurate, right, to say that.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the Smithsonian Institute, what did they
Yeah, right.
published, lasted 2 days,
Yeah.
some article, Robin DiAngelo, I think, had a hand in it,
Yeah, I saw that.
that showed that these things are Western, logical thinking,
Like
hard work,
punctuality, like, yeah.
scientific method, and things like that, right? Yeah, so these, I mean, they just ticked off a whole lot of African Americans with that.
Right. That was well, more than just poor form, but I'll leave it at that. So, okay, Corey, I mean, this has been great. I mean, we've gone through, just to recap, these sort of 3 phases that we wanted to touch on, the development of the kind of intellectual history that led to missional drift, especially in the big Protestant universities, how they became first dominated by naturalism, with sort of the natural sciences as its operational arm, but then this quick emergence of sort of cultural Marxism that came over from Germany through the Frankfurt School, and then sort of filtered through the social sciences and the humanities, and that has just been sort of launched upon us now, and that we're dealing with that in real time in the culture. And then some possible road forward with some co-belligerents, if you will, with atheists, even who still hold that truth is knowable, that we can access it, that we can use reason and logic to at least get to some standard by which we maybe can bring our lives, underneath that standard, even if it's just a standard of natural facts, where, of course, we're going to go further and say that there are metaphysical facts that we need to align ourselves with, and how that is very different from the critical theorist who says that these are all just constructs. So if my construct if I can get my construct to sort of win the day, which again sounds very Nietzschean, then too bad for you. One thing that I'd like to finish with, if we have a few more minutes, is how does this affect our churches? And if you have some time, where have we seen this right now in some of our more conservative Christian universities and seminaries? And what can we do about it?
Yes, very concerning. A lot of people, I don't care about this, too philosophical, too political, I don't care. Well, you will be made to care. It's coming for you. After Nazi Germany happened, you ended up having Pastor, what was it, Niemöller, who said first they came for the trade unionist. I was not a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. Then they came for the socialist. I wasn't a socialist. I didn't speak up. Then they came for the Jew. I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak up. Last of all, they came for me and no one else was left.
Hmm.
Well, they're coming. And I think to understand how this has invaded the Christian church and seminaries and academic societies and so forth, you have to recognize why it's been so attractive. Remember, phase one happened by something a bit more dry. It was scientific naturalism that worked through liberal Protestantism, and they wanted to hang on to morality. That's all they could hang on to, but no grounding to metaphysical framework was gone. The epistemological confidence for it was gone, but they wanted to hang on to the morality, borrowing capital of a bygone worldview. They wanted to hang on to it, and so it issued in the social gospel. Phase two is beginning with naturalism, but Marxist critical theory has issued in social justice, not the social gospel, which is not very different, but it is in terms of the radical and ravenous nature of the Stalinist rioters and anarchists and silencers and so forth that are trying to take over. They're forcing this thing now. Well, how did this capture so many people? Abraham Lincoln said this. He said, in this age, in this country, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Against it, nothing can succeed. Whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces judicial decisions. The emotions, the passions. Rhetoric is about logos, ethos, and pathos. Persuasion, rhetoric. Logos, we often think of logic. Ethos, ethics, credibility, so forth. Pathos, the passions. Mm-hmm. Part of persuasion, the emotions. The Christians are given over to this stuff like prey, like fish in a barrel, for a couple reasons. We are living, number one, in the most anti-intellectual period of the church age, R.C. Sproul once said, and it's true. I think it was, who wrote the book, Scandal of the American Mind, Mark Knoll.
The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, Mark Knoll, right?
Yes, the Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which was to say there isn't an evangelical mind anymore. It's sad. We are anti-intellectual. Remember, all up to 1840 of the presidents of the universities were members of the clergy. Mm-hmm. Our pastors, largely, for so many of them, not all, don't value loving God with our mind. We love with our hands, soup kitchens, and with our hearts, connecting with passion, worship conferences. But our heads, what's that? We kicked out that member of the Trinity, and it allowed in that vacuum something else to enter in, and now our people are ill prepared. We train them up in the way they should go, and when they get older, they get assimilated into the system at the universities, 70% falling away. That's how I ended up in doing what I'm doing today. The second way this came about, not just the secularists who have figured out a brilliant way to get Christian parents to pay for the apostasy of their own children, the universities, but how social justice captured the minds and hearts, really, of the Christian community. Because it captured the passions. It uses not dry stuff like methodological naturalism, scientific naturalism. It uses the language of ethics. It's about compassion. It's about justice. Mm-hmm. It's redefining, it's capturing the Christian ethical terms and saying, what would Jesus do? Hate or celebrate? What would Jesus do? Well, he wouldn't hate. That's right. He would celebrate. And now it's gone beyond celebrate diversity. It's you're either racist or anti-racist. Which one do you want to be? Well, not a racist. That's right. You want to be anti-racist. Yes. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean just not racist. It means, according to Ibram X. Kendi, you can't be anti-racist without being anti-capitalist. You can't be anti-capitalist without being anti-racist. You can't be anti-racist without being anti-homophobic and transphobic and every category, race, sex, gender, and so forth. It's about throwing out the entire system. We are experiencing revolution here. And the churches have bought this because we assume a doctrine of original sin that we are all sinners. And so we are very easily convinced when someone says you're a sinner. Well, yeah. You're guilty. Well, yeah. You're unjust. Well, yeah. You're an oppressor. Well, yeah. You're white, male, Christian, heteronormative oppressor, and all these other people are down and out, and they're dying and committing suicide, and you're the cause of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. Yeah. No longer is it skinny jeans and fog machines in the churches. It's now social justice, and everybody wants to be part of that game. It's a Trojan horse. Most of what's in it is social injustice, but they don't realize that. And we're up a creek here. We've got some serious work to do. I think pastors need to be teaching parents and youth not just how to survive in the universities, but to thrive. And now it's K through 12. Campus ministries need to reach not only students, but faculty and administrators. Professors are the 1040 window of the Western world, the most unreached and influential people group. It's the greatest omission of the Great Commission. And professors and senior administrators who are Christians should focus on hiring before retiring. We need to think strategically, like the neo-Marxists have done so well.
Right.
They were very patient, very methodical. They took our universities and used them against us.
Right. And I only see a handful. I think I just saw SES, and I think you were cited. You were quoted in their statement, SES, Southern Evangelicals, that came out with the first statement I've seen that has really been a serious pushback against this agenda that is taking over our schools and our churches.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So Corey, I mean, we could do a whole nother podcast on, you brought up a lot of things there at the end, just how language is manipulated, the guilt shame tactics that are used to try and draw us into this and say, oh, I have to do this. I'm a Christian. It's just, I need to, right? We see so much of this going on. So I think, we'll probably have to have you on again, maybe to go into depth on some of those things. But I do want to just emphasize that we have to train the life of the mind, and I know that's what Ratio Christi is focused on. And that's one of the reasons why we've launched this podcast, right? Again, another motto is that we're building on the past for the sake of the future. We're not tearing down the past. We're building on the past for the sake of the future. And if we don't understand the history of ideas and the history of the church and how the church has fended off attacks like this in the past, if we don't have any kind of legacy of our own to draw from, which is another thing that's so disconcerted me about the contemporary evangelical church, is no understanding of our church past at all. The great thinkers from, the early church fathers all the way through, to the Princetonians, right? And it's lost to us, our own sort of historical legacy. And we need to draw from that if we're going to fight off the barbarians here at the gate.
Yes.
But I'm going to end with that. I want to thank you again for being the first of our hopefully many guests on the Equal Justice podcast. We'll hope to see you again soon. And
Congratulations. Good to be here.
We hope to have a lot of fruitful alliances in the future. And we'll be praying for your continued work with guys like Peter Boghossian, and that we hope that you guys can have some real impact together on our university campuses. So,
thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Corey.
Appreciate what you're doing.
All right.
Bye-bye.
God bless, brother. Bye.